Now we begin the study of Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. And the Euthyphro is an early dialogue of Plato's, at least we think, according to modern scholarship. There's some debate about how to organize Plato's dialogues, because there's several of them. By and large, it's probably the case that Plato wrote the Euthyphro early in his writing career. We'll talk a little bit about that in a later video. But for now, it's a dialogue that centers on a question of religion. And it's a philosophical, theological type of question. We'll get to that in a bit. What I want to do is pull back and look at Greek society. So what's the background of Plato's Euthyphro? So when you're engaging with an academic text, especially one like a primary text, such as something written by Plato or Kant or Hume or any of the great philosophers or any of the great novelists or great figures of history or whatever the case may be, it's a good idea to get some background, some context, background to the text. So let's start off with a standard question, and I'm going to presume you haven't done this before. You really haven't studied the ancient Greeks. So first question. Why study the ancient Greeks? Who cares? They lived so long ago. Well, there's a number of reasons for looking at them. First, let's look at some of the love affair with the ancient Greeks that a number of famous writers have had, and I'm going to pick two. Two British poets, two of the great romantic British poets. A fellow named Lord Byron, and I'm talking about his life around 1812, and John Keats around 1820. Byron was he's a young guy, he's a lord, he's rich, he's kind of like a rock star of his day. And around 1812, he's written poetry exalting ancient Greece. So when I say Greece, I mean ancient Greece, around 300-ish BC. So he says, he writes that, immortal, O Greece, O immortal, though no more, though fallen, great. So even though Greece was gone in a way, clearly the ancient Greeks aren't around today. Modern Greece is quite different. And even modern Greek is not the same as ancient Greek. So if you can read and speak one and handle one, that doesn't mean you can handle the other. A number of years ago when I was in Greece, I asked about the ancients and whatever, and some people there told me that they studied it in school, but it was quite different than the modern version. Much like try and go and read Old English, go and try to read Beowulf in the original. You can't do it. It's almost a completely different language. In any case, so Lord Byron, he's this rich kind of rock star of his time, and what did he do? He eventually went to Greece and fought for Greek independence. So he was just mesmerized by this country, or this image he had of Greece. Same thing with John Keats, Ode to a Grecian Urn, a very famous poem. He thought that if you stared enough into these Greek urns and you looked at all the artwork on them, that somehow you would get some truth, some deep truths about the universe. And as he said, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. So this idea of ancient Greece as being some kind of mysterious, wonderful, extravagant place was deeply entrenched in the Romantic poets and many people's ideas of Greece. It was sort of this utopia of truth and beauty, this long lost time, right? And that's a familiar narrative. Lots of people talk about the olden days as wonderful. Well, thanks to modern scholarship, we've looked at what these guys wrote. And if you read sort of the history of history books on Greece, you see a gradual movement away from this notion of ancient Greece as a utopia of truth and beauty, but not to abandon it, but in a sense to enlarge it, to say, yes, there were some incredible things of the time, but let's not kid ourselves. Ancient Greece was quite the place in a number of ways. We have a less romanticized view of ancient Greece. For instance, we know full well, and we take this very seriously, ancient Greece was a slave society. So when Plato and the gang are hanging around talking about truth and justice, someone's serving the figs and pouring the wine. Who's doing that? Slaves. Maybe some of the interlocutors do it from time to time, but basically it's run on slavery. And Athens was like that. It was a democracy. It wasn't a pure democracy by any means. Lots of people couldn't vote. Women didn't have any power really at all. They just mostly ran the households. Households had slaves in them, especially if you were wealthy, of course. So slavery was built into the society. So, subservience of women was built into the society. So most of the people that got to live in any way like this utopia of truth and beauty, those were largely wealthier men and free men, because not all men were free. Some were slaves. So it was a pretty rough, brutal place. They were constantly fighting wars. So if you read about the history of ancient Greece, it's largely one war after another. And the backdrop, for instance, of Plato, when he was a young man and Socrates was alive, and Plato was listening to Socrates, and Socrates is going around in the streets essentially bugging everybody, asking them if they really knew the things they claimed to know. Wars were raging, right? So this idea of slavery built into the society, war, it was a very militaristic society. It was militarized, right? So lots of the men, they would tend their farms, their olive groves and a variety of the plants that they grew in Attica, which was the region surrounding Athens. They would be growing their stuff. They were farmers. And then at certain times of the year, they would pick up and they would go off to battle. And Athens was always involved in wars. It was a military power, a very dominant naval military power, and it was struggling against the Persians for a while, and sort of an external power. It also struggled against other Greeks, namely the Spartans. So the great war between the city of Sparta and the city of Athens, the heavy militarized city of Sparta and the militarized democracy of Athens, they clashed. Athens is the dominant naval power. Sparta is the dominant land-based power. So it's a real interesting and complicated war. And eventually Athens does lose it. But a Greek civil war is raging at the time. So these are hardly a bunch of peaceniks. This is a rough and tumble place. And think of it, bad weather, crops fail, you could starve. So you're always worried about weather and starvation. You have a nasty impacted wisdom tooth. Well, think about it. Dentistry in ancient Greece? It's quite a horrible thought, right? So dentistry isn't something, it's a sort of a highly modern thing that not even all of the world gets to take it for granted. But certainly back then, nobody would have taken, excellent medical treatment for granted. It was all quite primitive. It was dangerous. You could die of very simple and straightforward things that we cure quite easily today. So it was a rough and tumble place. And archaeological evidence shows, that the bodies, that's my dog, the bodies of the ancient Greeks, the remains of bones, so lots of wear on the teeth and, the coarse grains that they ate, etc., etc. So, ancient Greece, fascinating, important, rough, but it did have this notion of truth and beauty and all these kinds of things. So it's a fascinating study. So in our look into ancient Greece, a key thing in the background is religion. And religion is a complex notion. What I want you to do right away, though, is to try and put your modern notions of religion. I don't care if you have what religious background, or if you have a religious background. I don't really care. But what you're going to have is some sort of conceptual understanding of religion that you want to put to the side, because it's probably a modern understanding of religion. Now, what I want to do is have a look a second at the notion of myth, and that's important to the background context to Plato's Euthyphro.